Hey, Larken Rose here, and I want to do a video about how the threshold between disobedience and resistance is still kind of huge. So this all ties in with the belief in authority, which I talk about all the time. But there's a level at which people will, have had enough and we're not going to go along with this and we're not going to obey, but they feel like civil disobedience is acceptable at a certain point, but actual resistance isn't. So, for example, there's a lot of people who think that, government's doing some horrible thing. They're having some war, there's some shutdown or some restriction or other that we don't like. So we're going to go have a protest and say, we don't like this, as if they care in the slightest. Or we're going to disobey. We're going to do the civil disobedience, so we're doing what we're not supposed to. But then when the thugs of the state show up to chase them away or arrest them or whatever, most of them will just sort of quietly submit. Now, as usual, there's the tactical side of this. Some people will put up with that because they think that forcibly resisting will just make it even worse for themselves and they'll get beat up or shot and killed or something. But there's also an element of the perceived morality of actually resisting. So you get this, and I wish I could remember the quote. There was there's been a number of people who said things. One was Martin Luther King Jr., who basically, I don't want to misquote him, but basically it had the general sentiment of, we're going to go out there and disobey, but then we're going to responsibly, take the consequences. And to me, that's kind of despicable. And because it reinforces the idea that if authority commands something bad and you disobey, then authority still has the right to punish you for not doing the bad thing. And most people don't put it into these words, and they don't even think clearly enough to really think in anything like a principle. But there's a lot of people who do that, who the level to which they will not go along with authoritarian injustice isn't at all the same as it would be if the injustice was being perpetrated by some random person. To make a sort of silly example, if there's some carjacker in a town who's stealing cars and a bunch of people find out who he is and they go have a protest in front of his house and carry signs that say, stop carjacking us. First of all, that's exactly as useful as most political protests. They know you don't like it. They don't care. They're victimizing you. Telling them that telling the victimizer you don't like being victimized. Why do you think that's going to improve things? You really think they're going to go, I thought you liked it all that time. Sorry about that. So we have this group of people protesting the home of the carjacker. No more carjacking. Stop stealing our cars. And if somebody says, well, how about if we do something about it? And whether it's right now or if we catch him in the act, punch him out or pull a gun on him, or somebody maybe, if he's using a gun to steal cars, maybe somebody should defend themselves. In that case, people might still say, well, on a practical basis, that might be dangerous, so maybe I don't dare to. But if there's some armed carjacker stealing cars and then one of his intended victims just shoots him, most people are going to go, okay, good job. And maybe people will go, it's kind of sad that there wasn't a less extreme way to stop him, but whatever. You can argue about the level of resistance that's justified, but nobody's going to condemn the potential victim for defending himself against an aggressor. Except maybe the mother of the aggressor in some delusional cases we've seen. My poor son, he was such a good boy. Yeah, he was committing violent assault and armed robbery, but did you need to shoot him? Yeah, they needed to shoot him because he was committing violence and armed robbery. So aside from the occasional completely delusional mother who has no grasp on reality and will somehow manage to imagine her violent son to be the victim, everybody else would say to the potential victim, to the intended target, Good for you if you defend yourself. Now compare that to government injustice. Like, okay, the 80 billionth video came out showing cops beating the hell out of somebody, like maybe literally beating them to death when they're helpless and they're unarmed and they're crying for help, and it just literally beats them to death. And there's a whole lot of examples of that. Now, the number of people who will say, that's horrible, let's have a protest, like, that's almost everybody. I mean, not necessarily everybody will bother to go to a protest, but anybody who has a shred of decency in them can say, that was horrible, that shouldn't have happened, I object, and I'm condemning the people who did it. Okay, good for you. I mean, it doesn't exactly take tons of virtue to point out the bleeding obvious when everybody recognizes that was horribly evil, that shouldn't have happened. But okay, at least people are saying something. Let's take the case of Kelly Thomas, which is horrible. If you haven't seen it, I suggest not looking it up unless you want to be enraged, if you have any shred of decency within you. Because it's just horrible. It's a bunch of sadistic, fascist, evil pieces of crap literally beating someone to death who's totally helpless and not fighting back and unarmed and crying for mercy. It's just, well, I won't even get into the details because it's freaking horrible. But if you think what I'm about to say is too extreme, then go look it up and watch the video and tell me if it's too extreme. So, lots of people can say that's horrible. I don't even know if there ever was a protest, because in that case the victim was white, and so the media didn't care about it and didn't tell everybody, you should be protesting. They tortured and brutalized this white guy to death. But, I mean, who cares? But lots of people were righteously really damn outraged when the video came out to show just how horrible it was. And so almost everybody would be on board saying that was horrible. Now imagine what would happen. Now, this is not a suggestion, this is a hypothetical. So YouTube will still probably take this video down. Imagine somebody said, that was so horrible. Like, if a gang did that, just some street gang, found some guy and beat him to death over this prolonged period of time where he's crying for mercy. If somebody said, well, that's not okay, that's not happening in my city, and they went down and they hunted down and executed every member of the gang who was involved in that, what would the public say? What would everybody say? Pretty much everybody, whether they dared to say it out loud, would be, well, good for that guy, because what they did was horrible. They demonstrated that they're just evil, sadistic pieces of crap who shouldn't be walking the planet. It wasn't just, it was a bad judgment call at a given moment. Like, there's lots of cases that are like that. This was just sadistic, horrible, inhuman violence that they committed. And if it was just a street gang and somebody just said, I'm going to go hunt them down for what they did. I mean, there's a ton of movies that are based on that. A gang of nasty bastards do something horrible and somebody hunts them down and the whole audience goes, yay, you hunted down these evil pieces of crap. Incidentally, I don't even think that the motivation of revenge is healthy or useful, even though it's very understandable and it's very, hatred and all that in response to outright evil like that is very understandable. But that's sort of a side issue, because what you have in your head is a different thing. Basically, I would rather somebody view them as rabid dogs. Like, here's this gang that just brutalized somebody to death for no reason at all, except they just do that. And the person goes, well, I'm just going to go hunt them down like they're rabid dogs and make them not exist anymore, so their next potential victim doesn't have to go through that. And not only would most of society go, well, good for you, excellent, they'd make a big movie out of it. Make $100 million making a movie of somebody hunting down these sadistic bastards and just taking them out. Just, I'm ending you because you've demonstrated that you don't know how to be a human being, so you get to be dead. For the sake of your next potential victim, you get to not breathe anymore. Lots of movies about exactly that. And people go, rah, rah, rah. Change the setting to now the gang of sadistic, evil, psychotic bastards is wearing badges and uniforms. How would most of the country respond if the exact same thing happened? Somebody said, well, they've demonstrated they don't know how to be human beings. They're just sadistic sociopaths, and I'm going to go hunt them down so that this doesn't have to happen to anybody else. In the exact same scenario, with the exact same details, and the only difference being they were wearing badges and uniforms, how would people respond to retaliatory force, including deadly force? Because keep in mind, there was nothing legal about what they did. This was a gang of murderers who happened to be wearing uniforms at the time, committing assault and torture and murder. It had nothing to do with enforcing anything. He wasn't resisting, he wasn't fighting back, he wasn't armed. It was just brutality and torture and murder. So even by their own rules, it didn't change the legality at all that they were agents of authority, because in that case they weren't. They were just evil, sadistic thugs. How would most people respond? How would most conservatives respond to somebody who became a cap killer and hunted down these sadistic sociopaths? Well, you can't take the law into your own hands. That's why conservatives have no spine and no principle. And I say that as someone who used to be one. Because they kind of pretend to believe in freedom in lots of ways, except when the worst violators of individual liberty, agents of the state, are out there violating people's rights, and somebody says, I'm going to defend myself. I'm not just going to disobey and let them beat me up. I'm actually going to defend myself and resist and escalate my use of force to whatever level they're doing it. And that means if they're going to shoot at me and try to kill me for when I didn't victimize anybody, I didn't commit any crime with any victim, then I'm going to defend myself. If somebody does that, there are a lot of conservatives who will instantly transform into mindless bootlickers, making excuses even when the badge-wearing perpetrators had no legal justification for what they did. And that is because of the authoritarian indoctrination. So people sometimes ask me, like, do you think it's easier for the political left or the political right to become voluntarists? And a lot of people think that it should be easier for conservatives or the right side of the political bootlicking spectrum, because they think, well, at least they have principles and kind of believe in freedom, and it's more philosophical principle-based than sort of the mushy, emotional-based leftists, which kind of has some truth to it, except the piece of authoritarianism that they cling to and they're indoctrinated into, they can be just as attached to it to the point where they will defend absolutely homicidal sociopaths if they happen to wear badges. And then, well, you can't resist, you can't become a cop killer, you have to take them to court, and you can't take the law in your own hands, which means you grovel, you lick the boots, and do whatever the masters tell you and hope that they give you justice. That's what the right-wing statists constantly demonstrate in their mentality. Even when they go rah, rah, rah about Independence Day, which was literally a bunch of people committing treason and breaking the law and shooting at law enforcement. That's literally what the American Revolution was. That is a literal description of what happened in the American Revolution. And all the Americans that go rah, rah, rah about that and are conservatives would absolutely condemn and hate anyone who did the exact same thing today. Like in the case of Kelly Thomas. And that shows the power of an indoctrination where, like, most of those people would still look at that, like, if they watch the video, they'd go, that's horrible. Like, their conscience would tell them that was really bad. Those cops shouldn't have done that. That was dreadful. Okay, was it as bad as if a street gang had done the same thing? Like, the exact same thing, down to the detail, the exact same number of times hitting him while he's crying for mercy? Is the morality the same? And most of them would kind of know, yeah, of course it's the same. So should the response be the same? Is the morality of the reaction to that the same based on whether they're wearing clown uniforms with badges or whether they're just the Bloods or the Crips or some other street gang? Does the morality of that change? And so while I think it's true that Often it's an easier path for people who are conservative, constitutionalist, minarchist, leaning somewhere in that ballpark to think their way out of statism. There is still very much an emotional and psychological attachment to authority, to the point where even if they agree with disobeying, the idea of actually lifting a finger against one of the king's guards is so much against their indoctrination of the troop worship and the cop worship and all that crap that their brains short circuit. And one of the most obvious examples of that is the way they talk about gun control. You can have my gun when you pry it from my cold dead fingers. Okay? Like, so far so good. I agree. You shouldn't let yourself be disarmed, Mr. Conservative. When a bunch of people show up at your front door in their fancy law enforcer costumes with their badges, then what? What happens to your principles? Because on the one hand, those are the boots you've been licking your whole frickin' life, and pretending that anybody who disrespects our brave men and women in law enforcement and doesn't do as they're told must be a horrible terrorist hippie scum. Okay, so are you going to be a horrible terrorist hippie scum or a boot-licking slave? Because those are your options. They show up at your door, you're either going to disarm or you're going to resist them. Which is it going to be? And completely aside from like the philosophical excuses that they'll try to make, it's really just their indoctrinated Pavlovian response to the concept of authority that makes them unable to process this and actually be consistent or have anything resembling an actual principle in their head. And it's not just conservatives, but I'm picking on them right now because the glaring hypocrisy of conservatives when it comes to pointing out police abuse is just amazing, because they pretend to be in favor of freedom and don't violate my rights and I have the right to be armed and I have all these rights. And if the guy with the badge violates them, yes, sir, right away, sir, I'm cooperating, sir, I'll do whatever you say, sir. So you don't at all believe in individual rights. You just like talking about it. But if somebody actually defends themselves against an aggressor, against the violator of individual rights, if somebody actually takes seriously the idea that when a government is a violator of individual rights, which is always, all the time, with every government everywhere in the world throughout all of history, then the people have the right and duty to alter or abolish that government. You go rah, rah, rah about the Declaration of Independence. It said that. How many conservatives believe that? None. Not one. Not one conservative is actually consistent on the concept expressed in that one line in the Declaration of Independence that says, when any government becomes destructive of individual liberties, it is the right and duty of the people to alter or abolish it. And that was in the context of a document telling the king to go get stuffed because we're not going to answer to you and we're not paying taxes to you anymore. So heck with you, and if you send your enforcers after us, we're going to respond with force. Zero conservatives believe that. None. Because any conservative, any human being who actually believed that would have to go rah, rah, rah in favor of the people forcibly resisting law enforcement. Because law enforcement is obviously the biggest violator of individual rights in the world. They always are, everywhere. But in this country, it's gotten ridiculous to the point where what the modern constitutional republic does to the people is 1,000 times more oppressive than King George III ever was, or ever dreamed of being. So where are the conservatives who actually believe in the Declaration of Independence, so that if an individual or a group of people said, yeah, they're violating individual rights, we're going to go alter or abolish their butts one way or another? Where are the conservatives going, well, yeah, you have the right to, and Declaration of Independence says so, and I agree? None of them believe that. Not one. And not one of them recognizes the insane hypocrisy and contradiction of pretending to believe in the Declaration of Independence and then condemning anyone who actually does what it said by forcibly resisting evil that's done in the name of law enforcement. None of them. And that was true when I was one too. So I'm bashing my former self as much as I'm bashing everybody else. And it's because of that difference in threshold. Like lots of people, well, I'll vote and I'll protest and maybe I'll even disobey. Like I'm going to hide my guns. Okay, good for you. If they make it illegal and you hide your guns, I'm all in favor of that. You're being a lawbreaker, which I don't care about, but you seem to sort of half the time care about, Mr. Conservative. But if they show up to say, well, now we're going to put you in a cage because we found out you were hiding your guns, do you have the right to resist, or do you have an obligation to let them cage you for like the rest of your life? Just that question can make almost any conservative's brain screech to a halt, and then they have to think about it and process it. If those brave men and women in law enforcement whose boots you lick are at your front door saying, we found out you hid your firearms and sorry, we're just following orders. We don't make the law, we just enforce it, but the law is you get to get locked up for 30 years for illegally possessing a firearm. Now what? Do you have an obligation to let them cage you for 30 years, or do you have the right to resist? Pick one, because it can't be both. And it can't be neither. It's one or the other. Which is it? And this is just one example of many that, the questions in Candles in the Dark. I'm not being very nice or gentle in this video. In Candles in the Dark, we get people up to their contradictions a lot more nicely and gently than I just did. But it's one of the many inherent contradictions that exist in every status head, conservative, liberal, anything between, I don't care. But just to have them try to define at what point is the target of law enforcement justified in resorting to the same level of force that the law enforcers use to try to make them obey. And so even a lot of people who are in favor of like vote and protest and say tough things online, when it comes right down to it, it's like, well, now your choices are get victimized by the state or become a cop killer. Which do you have the right to do? Which do you have the obligation to do? Do you have the obligation to allow yourself to be victimized? Or do you have the right to do the one thing that'll stop you from being victimized, even if that's shooting your victimizer who happens to be wearing a badge? And it's a question that's really dang uncomfortable for like every conservative because they're trained to not think about that stuff. They're trained to imagine that you can be pro-law enforcement and pro-freedom. And you can't. And that's why there's all these delusional people out there who don't see the irony in the fact that their cool pickup truck has a thin blue line sticker right next to a come and take it Gadsden flag sticker. And it doesn't even occur to them. Those are the ones who are going to come and take it. What are you going to do when they do? Well, look, I'm a supporter of you. Oh, that's very nice. Thanks. We're here to take your guns. And since you didn't turn them over before, we're here to lock you up. I support the men and women. How long? To what extent? At what point do you stop pretending your abuser and victimizer deserves your praise and support and cooperation? And at what point do you start treating them like a mere mortal human being who's being a violent, immoral, sadistic aggressor? When they do that all the time. But that's just one of many demonstrations that the belief in authority completely warps people's perception of reality and their moral code without them even recognizing, without them even noticing. And it's amazing how many people, just a simple line of questioning can very quickly get to the point where they're like, whoa, I'm not sure, I'll have to think about that. Like, so for years and years and years, you went rah, rah, rah about this and rah, rah, rah about that, and you never noticed that they didn't at all match? And that there's a giant conflict? Don't tread on me, and also I support the people who tread on me. Like, you never noticed. And there's a lot of those. I've seen a lot of vehicles with both of them on them. Now, to try to be a little bit nice, I'm glad they have the Gadsden flag and they come and take it and the expression of rebelliousness. I just want them to at some point notice you're not done rebelling against your own indoctrination because you're still praising your abusers. You are still wearing as a badge of pride the fact that you're loyal to the people who are abusing you and robbing you and controlling you and violating your rights. And it can be very difficult for conservatives to sort that out, to sort that contradiction out. I know because I was one. And it took me a long time to give up my delusional, ingrained belief that authority is actually a thing and that obedience to law enforcement is somehow virtuous. No, it isn't. Not at all. There is zero case in which respecting the law is the moral reason to do anything. Like, the reason to not murder people isn't because there's a law about it. It's because it's wrong to murder people. The reason to not steal isn't because there's a law about it. It's because it's bad to steal people's stuff. So anytime there's a law that matches morality, okay, whoop-de-doo, you scribbled some stuff about it. The morality is what matter. And when they conflict with morality, which is all the time, why the hell would you go rah, rah, rah for the people doing the immoral stuff under the guise of law enforcement? Why do you think that makes you pro-freedom or pro-law and order, or even the concept of law and order, which I've talked about before? The notion that law and order is one thing. No, it isn't. The notion that being a criminal means bad and being law-abiding means good. No, it doesn't. Read a history book. Sometimes they match, sometimes they conflict, and in no case should you be betraying what's moral in favor of what's legal. In no case should you judge someone's actions based on the costume they're wearing instead of based on what they're actually doing. And in no case should you judge the reaction of their victims based on the uniform worn by their victimizers. If they're committing immoral aggression, I don't give a crap what they're wearing. People have a right to defend themselves. And that very simple, self-obvious principle is very, very, very difficult for most conservatives to all the way process and accept. And I know, because it took me a long, awkward, stupid process, even when I believed in a tiny limited government, to finally give up that last step and realize, no, the badges and the uniforms and the law enforcer status don't earn anybody's respect at all. Being a moral human being does. Defending the innocent, that's deserving of respect. It's not what cops do 99% of the time. But letting go of that is so difficult for so many people. It's difficult for everybody who believes in government. But for this video, it's just particularly bashing the conservative side of the spectrum, because they can talk so eloquently about so many things about freedom and then completely betray all of it by going rah, rah, rah for the very people who violate all those principles of freedom every single day, every state in the union, constantly. Well, I wish they would do the right thing, but I'm going to support them whether they do the right thing or not. It's like, okay, then you're a cheerleader for evil. Way to go. Sooner or later, you have to pick a side between what is right and what is legal. And so far, the vast majority of conservatives are still on the wrong stinking side. Well, the vast majority of statists, left, right, and everything in between, are still on the wrong stinking side. And my goal is to get them to trust their own conscience, their own moral code, instead of the authoritarian indoctrination that's been pounded into their head for their whole life. So it's a challenge getting people to do that, but we've seen lots of progress in recent years where a lot of people, including former enforcers of the state, have finally come to realize the morality of an act and the morality of the response to that act have absolutely nothing to do with what costumes anybody's wearing or what offices or job descriptions anybody has. Right is right and wrong is wrong, and legislation has nothing to do with it.